In the conflict-ridden medieval world, mercenaries did not appear as an anomaly, but as a direct consequence of constant warfare. As lords waged war, repeatedly, the demand for manpower exceeded what could be supplied by local peasants and feudal knights. From this need emerged armies not bound to land or traditional loyalty. Mercenaries fought not for homeland or family honor, but for wages and the chance to survive. They came from many different regions, bringing extensive battlefield experience but no lasting allegiance. This made them flexible, difficult to control, and particularly dangerous. Unbound by local laws, they were willing to fight for anyone who could pay enough. When contracts ended or were broken, they could become a threat to the very lands that had hired them. The existence of mercenaries altered the nature of medieval warfare. Violence was no longer merely a feudal obligation. It became a profession that could be bought and sold. Mercenaries grew accustomed to killing as a form of everyday work. They carried no illusions of glory, caring only about survival and spoils. This made their style of warfare especially ruthless and pragmatic. Civilians were particularly terrified when mercenary bands entered their territory. They brought with them reputations for looting, arson, and uncontrollable violence. Even before any battle occurred, their mere presence sowed deep fear. Cities often shut their gates upon hearing that such forces were approaching. Mercenaries thus became symbols of raw, unvarnished warfare. They reflected the darkest side of medieval society, where human life could be priced in coin. From this role, they came to be regarded as the most feared armies of the age. The terror inspired by mercenaries came not only from their weapons, but from the fact that they were bound by nothing except self-interest. Without loyalty, violence became unpredictable and easily slipped beyond control. From this context of emergence, it is necessary to look more closely at who these men were. Their origins and living conditions shaped the distinctive brutality of medieval mercenaries. Most medieval mercenaries were not born to wield swords. They were driven into violence by circumstance. They were often peasants who had lost their land after war, famine, or expulsion by a lord. With no fields to till and no protection from village communities, they were forced to seek other means of survival. War became the only place willing to accept them, as long as they were strong enough to carry weapons. Others were discharged soldiers who had not been fully paid and had nowhere left to return to. Some were criminals fleeing punishment, joining mercenary bands to disappear into a wandering mass. Young men without inheritance rights saw in this profession a chance for quick money. Recruiters painted alluring images of plunder and wages to attract the desperate. Few spoke of the low survival rates or the frequent betrayals by those who hired them. Those who joined carried bitterness, anger, and a deep fear of starvation. They had little reason to obey the moral norms of a society that had cast them aside. This made them quick to resort to violence without hesitation. Within mercenary bands, strength and experience determined status, not birth. The most ruthless often survived the longest, becoming role models for new recruits. Over time, harsh conditions filtered out all but the coldest and most reckless individuals. Armies formed from such people were violent at their very core. They fought not to defend order, but to seize a chance at survival for themselves. The absence of social ties made them difficult to restrain with promises or notions of honor. When their interests were threatened, they were ready to turn their weapons against anyone. This background explains why mercenaries inspired far greater fear than many other forces. Their unstable origins meant mercenaries carried no enduring loyalty. They entered war with the mindset of those who had nothing left to lose but their lives. From this human foundation, it becomes necessary to examine how they fought and behaved on the battlefield. It was their pragmatic and unsentimental methods of warfare that spread the fearsome reputation of medieval mercenaries across the Middle Ages. Medieval mercenaries fought with one clear objective above all else, survival and maximum profit. They did not pursue glory or honor, but focused instead on efficiency and immediate results. On the battlefield, they avoided reckless actions that offered no clear benefit. Rather than charging first, they observed carefully and waited for favorable moments to strike. They were willing to retreat when the situation turned against them, as long as they preserved their strength and their lives. This style of fighting made them appear cowardly in the eyes of knights, yet it was extremely effective. Mercenaries typically targeted weaknesses in enemy formations instead of engaging head-on. They attacked inexperienced soldiers, supply units, or formations already in disarray. Killing quickly and decisively was preferred over prolonged combat. When the enemy line collapsed, they did not hesitate to pursue in order to seize loot. Compassion rarely surfaced in such moments. Those who fell and could no longer fight were often ignored or finished off. Mercenaries understood that leaving enemies alive behind them could invite danger later. Years of battlefield experience taught them that hesitation often meant death. As a result, decisiveness and ruthlessness became habits of survival. They readily used deception, ambushes, and sabotage to achieve their objectives. Actions considered dishonorable by others were to them simply intelligent choices. War in the eyes of mercenaries was a task to be completed, not a noble ritual. This pragmatism made them an unpredictable and dangerous force. Their cold, calculating methods spread their reputation alongside widespread fear. Their conduct on the battlefield clearly reflected their lack of lasting attachment or loyalty. They fought for nothing beyond survival and tangible reward. From this pragmatic approach to combat, it becomes necessary to examine how mercenaries treated civilians and the lands they passed through. It was this relationship that made mercenaries both hated and feared throughout the Middle Ages. For medieval civilians, mercenaries were often more frightening than the official enemy in a war. They had no ties to the lands they passed through, and therefore no reason to restrain their violence. When unpaid or during pauses in fighting, they considered looting a legitimate right. Villages along their route became the easiest sources of food and spoils. Livestock was driven away, granaries were emptied, and homes were searched without justification. Civilians could not tell which side mercenaries belonged to, since they could change employers at any time. This uncertainty spread fear even in regions thought to be safe. Women and children were especially vulnerable to uncontrolled violence. Such brutality was rarely punished because no local authority was strong enough to intervene. Mercenaries lived off the fear of the population, seeing terror as the quickest way to force compliance. Even when hired to provide protection, they could turn against those who employed them. Ordinary people understood that resistance almost always meant death. Many regions paid tribute simply to ensure these troops would pass through without total destruction. Their reputation for cruelty spread faster than the armies themselves. Even rumors of mercenaries approaching were enough to empty villages. That fear became deeply embedded in the collective memory of a medieval society. Mercenaries thus inflicted not only material damage, but also widespread psychological terror. Their presence turned war into a lingering nightmare, even in the absence of direct fighting. Through them, civilians experienced most clearly the darkest side of warfare, bought and sold for money. That is why mercenaries were regarded as the most terrifying forces of the age. The violent relationship with civilians shows that mercenaries existed outside any shared moral order. They stood beyond social restraints, guided only by immediate self-interest. From this brutality, it becomes necessary to examine how mercenary companies were organized and disciplined. It was this internal structure that allowed them to survive and remain dangerous throughout medieval. Despite being seen as chaotic and brutal, medieval mercenaries did not exist as an unorganized mob. To survive, and remained valuable in the marketplace of war. They were forced to build strict internal order. Each company was usually led by an experienced commander who held power over life and death within the group. Mercenary loyalty was not tied to land or homeland, but to the immediate leader. A commander who could distribute loot fairly was able to keep his force together over time. Internal rules were established to prevent soldiers from preying on one another and to maintain fighting strength. Violations of discipline could result in beatings, loss of shares, or execution in front of the entire company. Public punishment was intended to instill the fear necessary to preserve order. In an army without shared ideals, fear became the most effective binding force. Mercenaries learned to obey quickly in order to avoid severe consequences. This discipline allowed them to march, fight, and retreat more cohesively than many feudal levies. That very efficiency made them a desirable force to hire, despite their notorious reputation. Spoils were divided according to clear rules, providing direct motivation for each individual. Those who were bold and effective often received larger shares. This system of reward and punishment encouraged calculated ruthlessness. Harsh internal conditions hardened mercenaries into individuals accustomed to violence. Camaraderie existed, but it was fragile and closely tied to shared interests. When those interests disappeared, alliances could collapse rapidly. This iron discipline enabled mercenary companies to survive amid the chaos of medieval warfare. It also contributed to their danger and difficulty to control. Internal discipline shows that mercenaries were not random bandits, but organized instruments of violence. It was precisely this organization that made them effective tools of war, yet extremely risky ones. From this internal structure, it is necessary to examine the fragile relationship between mercenaries and those who hired them. It was this fragility that often led to betrayal and unforeseen catastrophe. The relationship between mercenaries and those who hired them was always temporary and deeply marked by suspicion. It was not bound by oaths or honor, but rested entirely on pay and immediately. As long as wages were paid on time, mercenaries were willing to fight fiercely for their employer. But when payment was delayed or promised spoils failed to materialize, loyalty quickly began to crumble. Employers typically viewed mercenaries as tools rather than long-term allies. This lack of respect gave mercenaries even less reason to remain faithful. In many cases, they threatened or pressured their employer to pay more in order to continue fighting. If their demands were not met, they might abandon the campaign outright. Leaving the battlefield was not considered betrayal within mercenary logic. They believed obligation existed only as long as money flowed. Some companies even changed sides in the middle of a conflict, causing severe chaos. As a result, employers constantly feared that the very force they paid might turn its weapons against them. To maintain control, some lords took hostages or delayed payment until the final moment. Such tactics only increased tension and the risk of mutiny. When wars ended without new contracts, mercenaries became a dangerous, uncontrolled presence. If not properly disbanded, they often wandered the countryside and survived through plunder. These unemployed bands were seen as disasters for rural regions. Civilians could not distinguish them from enemy forces. Only the continuation of violence mattered. The fragility of mercenary contracts made medieval warfare even harder to control. Mercenaries thus functioned as both a military solution and a latent threat. Relationships built on money made loyalty the most fragile element of all. In such a context, betrayal was not an exception but an ever-present possibility. From the instability of these contracts, it is necessary to examine the consequences mercenaries left behind when war temporarily subsided. It was precisely these consequences that caused them to be deeply hated in medieval memory. When war temporarily subsided, mercenaries did not simply disappear along with the clash of weapons. They continued to exist as homeless armed bands carrying both weapons and ingrained habits of violence. With no land to return to and no welcome from society, they were forced to find their own means of survival. Many companies broke apart into smaller groups that wandered through rural regions. Plunder became a substitute source of livelihood once wartime pay ran dry. Trade routes and isolated villages turned into frequent targets. Civilians could not distinguish them from former enemies. Only the continuation of danger was visible. Some lords attempted to rehire them, simply to avoid becoming victims themselves. This approach merely shifted violence from one place to another without addressing the root problem. Unemployed mercenaries were often more aggressive, having lost hope of new contracts. Internal discipline eroded as shared interests collapsed. The most ruthless individuals tended to survive and dominate these groups, pushing violence to extreme levels. Local communities lived in prolonged fear, even when major warfare had ended. Regions through which mercenaries passed often took many years to recover. Local authorities were rarely strong enough to confront them directly. Suppressing them required military force, which was costly and dangerous. Mercenaries thus became a persistent social problem, not merely a military one. They spread instability even during periods officially called peace. The fear of their return haunted the population. The image of mercenaries became inseparable from prolonged disaster after war. The continued existence of mercenaries after conflict shows that violence does not simply dissolve when fighting ends. It survives in other forms difficult to control and even harder to eliminate. From these social consequences, it is necessary to examine how kings and lords attempted to deal with this dangerous force. The inadequacy of their responses reveals the deep anxiety that haunted medieval rulers. Faced with the unpredictable danger posed by mercenaries, medieval monarchs and lords could not afford to ignore them. They understood that the very forces once hired to protect their power could quickly turn into grave threats. Some lords attempted to bind mercenaries with temporary oaths of loyalty. These oaths were often reinforced by severe punishments if broken. However, because such vows were not tied to land, family, or long-term obligation, they were easily disregarded. In some regions, hostages were taken to ensure mercenaries would not betray their employers. This method created a degree of restraint, but it also bred deep resentment. Other rulers tried to disband mercenary companies by paying them a single large sum. They hoped the money would be enough to scatter the troops and drive them out of their territory. In reality, many groups merely lay low and reassembled elsewhere once the money ran out. Some areas issued decrees banning mercenaries from bearing arms during peacetime. Such bans were difficult to enforce due to the lack of sufficient force to impose them. When pushed outside the law, mercenaries often became even more dangerous. Other lords chose to use mercenaries to suppress fellow mercenaries. This approach created a self-sustaining cycle of violence. No solution proved truly durable within a fragmented system of power. Each region focused only on protecting itself, unable to address the problem on a broader scale. Mercenaries thus continued to exist as the shadow of war. The fear felt by those in power reflected the fragility of medieval order itself. When instruments of violence slipped beyond control, authority became insecure as well. These attempts at control show that mercenaries were not frightening only to civilians. Even those who hired them lived in constant fear of betrayal. From the impotence of authority, it is necessary to turn to how mercenaries were remembered in medieval memory and storytelling. It was this collective memory that etched their terrifying reputation across generations. In the collective memory of medieval society, mercenaries were not merely soldiers, but symbols of wandering calamity. Stories about them were passed from village to village, from taverns to marketplaces, as dark warnings. People spoke of armed bands arriving without notice, carrying weapons, and cold, unreadable gazes. At the mere rumor of mercenaries approaching, many families hurried to hide their food or flee altogether. They were portrayed as people without homeland and without mercy. In folktales, mercenaries appeared alongside famine, burning homes, and the cries of children. This fear did not require concrete evidence because it had accumulated across generations. Even those who had never witnessed them directly believed disaster would follow wherever such troops pass. These memories overshadowed all other images of mercenaries. Few spoke in daily life of their discipline or battlefield skill. What endured most strongly was their brutality and unpredictability. Monks and chroniclers often described mercenaries in tones of deep caution. They were seen as signs of chaos and moral decay. Such portrayals helped legitimize repression whenever the opportunity arose. Even after wars ended, the fear did not fade. It followed merchants and pilgrims along lonely roads. Mercenaries became familiar villains within the collective imagination. Over time, this image detached from specific individuals and turned into a shared symbol. Their terror thus exceeded their actual numbers or military strength. It persisted as a shadow looming over medieval memory. Collective memory shows that mercenaries cause harm not only through their actions, but through the fear they spread. That fear outlived the very companies that eventually disbanded. From this remembered image, it is necessary to turn to a less discussed perspective. That is how mercenaries themselves understood their own role within a world shaped by constant violence. For the mercenaries themselves, the terrifying image society imposed on them was not their greatest concern. They viewed the world through the lens of survival, where each day lived through was a small victory. Most did not see themselves as villains, but as people doing necessary work in a chaotic age. When society offered them no land, no protection, and no future, war became the only path left open. Bearing arms was not a moral choice, but a reaction to poverty and constant uncertainty. They believed they were doing nothing different from what every lord did, only from a lower position within the power hierarchy. If violence was permitted for the powerful, then the powerless had the right to use violence to survive as well. Loyalty, in their view, was a commodity with a clear exchange value. No payment meant no obligation. They saw empty promises and abstract notions of honor as luxuries reserved for those protected by land and status. Cruelty was not their original nature, but something learned gradually through experience. Those who hesitated often died early, leaving behind harsh lessons for the survivors. Over time, emotions were worn down to avoid collapse under guilt and loss. War became a profession and violence a skill that had to be mastered. In such a world, mercy was considered more dangerous than brutality. Mercenaries learned to detach themselves from their victims in order to keep going. They understood that society would never fully accept them, yet that rejection did not stop them because there was no path back. Seen from the inside, mercenaries appear more as products of their age than as individual monstrosities. Their fearsome nature reflected the harshness of the society that created them. The way mercenaries justified their own actions shows how violence can become rational under extreme conditions. When survival is the absolute priority, all other standards are pushed aside. From this logic of survival, one must look to the final consequence mercenaries left behind in medieval history. It is this legacy that ultimately closes the image of the most feared armies of the age. The existence of mercenaries did not end with individual companies, but left deep marks on the very structure of medieval society. They helped transform war from a feudal obligation into an activity that could be bought and sold for money. Violence gradually became specialized, detached from ties of land and blood. This allowed warfare to spread more easily, since anyone with sufficient wealth could now wage war. Lords relied on mercenaries to overcome the limits of their local manpower. As a result, conflicts became easier to ignite and harder to control. Mercenaries also weakened traditional bonds between rulers and the populations they governed. When military force came from outside the protection of civilians became a secondary concern. Violence was imposed without long-term responsibility for its consequences. Regions that endured the presence of mercenaries often lost trust in all armed forces. Memories of them eroded any sense of safety in daily life. Their presence blurred the line between wartime and peace. Even during periods of calm, fear persisted because mercenaries could always return. This legacy helped sustain the chronic instability of medieval society. In the long run, fear of mercenaries pushed some rulers to seek standing armies under direct control. The need to contain and regulate violence became clearer than ever. Mercenaries thus became unintended proof of the dangers of uncontrolled force. They were a costly lesson in the price of commercialized warfare. Their legacy lies not in specific victories, but in how they changed society's understanding of war itself. That shift laid the groundwork for later transformations. The violent legacy of mercenaries shows that the consequences of war do not end with contracts or battles. They sink into the foundations of society and shape generations to come. From this legacy, it is necessary to close with a broader view of why mercenaries came to be seen as the most feared armies of the age. Only by bringing all these elements together can the final picture be complete. Mercenaries were regarded as the most feared armies of the Middle Ages, not simply because they were skilled fighters. The fear stemmed from the fact that they were bound to no land, no community, and no lasting oath. When warfare became a profession, violence lost what little moral restraint it once had. Mercenaries fought for money, yet the consequences of their actions far exceeded the value of any contract. They appeared wherever conflict erupted and disappeared when profit ran dry, leaving chaos behind. Civilians could not predict their behavior, nor could they appeal to honor or shared obligations. Even those who hired them lived in constant fear of betrayal. This uncertainty made mercenaries a permanent threat. They embodied the most naked face of war, where human lives could be bought and sold. Without ideals and without a homeland, they existed as instruments of pure violence. This made them highly effective, but also extraordinarily difficult to control. Medieval society feared mercenaries because it saw in them violence stripped of all restraint. They were products of an unstable age, yet they also helped prolong that instability. Through them, war ceased to be the duty of a warrior class and became an open market. When violence is commodified, anyone can become a victim. The terrifying reputation of mercenaries came not only from what they did, but from the fact that they could reappear at any time. They did not belong to peace yet. They did not vanish when wars ended. This suspended existence kept society in a constant state of vigilance. Mercenaries thus became symbols of endless war, and it was precisely this sense of endlessness that made them more frightening than any other force. In retrospect, mercenaries were not monsters born from individual darkness. They were mirrors reflecting a society that accepted violence as a means of survival. To understand mercenaries is to understand the limits of medieval order, for when violence is paid for, fear will always be the strongest currency.